The weight of a gentle heart. The night Keanu Reeves realized that kindness itself could become a burden, the city around him shimmered with lights that felt strangely distant, as if the world were celebrating something he had not yet earned. He stood alone near a tall window, the glass reflecting a quiet man whose face carried calm on the surface and storms beneath it. Applause echoed somewhere behind him, the kind reserved for success, admiration, and fame, yet none of it reached his heart. He had lived long enough to know that the loudest moments were rarely the most important. The real battles happened in silence, in the places no camera could ever follow. For years, people had spoken about Keanu as if he were untouched by life's chaos, a symbol of humility in an industry built on excess. They admired how he listened more than he spoke, how he treated strangers with the same respect as friends, how pain had shaped him without hardening him. What few understood was that empathy, when carried too deeply, could fracture a heart just as easily as cruelty. Loving without ego meant feeling everything, and that night, he felt more than he ever had before. It had started quietly, the way all complicated truths do. No dramatic moment, no sudden declaration, just a slow awareness that grew heavier with each passing day. Sandra Bullock had been part of his world for so long that her presence felt like memory itself, woven into his life through shared laughter, long conversations, and an unspoken understanding that required no explanation. With her, he never had to perform. She saw him as he was, not as a figure admired from afar, but as a man who carried history in his eyes and gentleness in his actions. Their bond had survived time, distance, and the changing rhythms of life, deepening into something that felt safe, familiar, and profoundly human. Then, at a moment when he believed he had already learned all the lessons life intended to teach him, another presence entered his world, not with noise or urgency, but with calm. Ana de Armas arrived like a quiet sunrise after a long night, not erasing the darkness that came before, but illuminating a path forward. She did not ask him to forget who he had been or what he had lost. Instead, she met him exactly where he stood, respecting the pauses in his speech, the silence between thoughts, the careful way he approached hope. With her, he felt something he had not allowed himself to name for a long time: renewal. And so, without realizing it at first, Keanu found himself standing at the intersection of two truths, neither wrong, neither selfish, both demanding honesty. One was built on years of shared understanding, loyalty, and emotional history. The other was formed from possibility, growth, and the courage to believe that the future could still hold something new. The conflict was not about choosing one person over another, but about choosing which version of himself he was ready to become. What made the choice unbearable was that no one was asking him to decide. Sandra never demanded answers. Her strength had always been rooted in dignity, in giving space rather than pressure. Ana, too, never pushed. She understood that healing could not be rushed and that love, if real, could survive patience. Yet their kindness, their restraint, only deepened the weight on his chest. He was not being pulled by expectation, but by responsibility, and responsibility, when paired with love, could be overwhelming. Publicly, nothing appeared different. Interviews came and went, smiles were exchanged, charitable visits were made quietly just as he preferred. But those closest to him noticed the change. His pauses grew longer. His gaze lingered on nothing, as though he were searching for an answer written somewhere beyond sight. Late at night, when the city finally rested, he found himself walking alone, letting the quiet streets absorb thoughts he could not speak aloud. He wondered when love had become something that required courage instead of comfort. The world, unaware of the storm beneath his calm exterior, began to speculate as it always did. People loved stories with simple endings, heroes who made bold choices and never looked back. But real life was rarely that clean. Real kindness did not always lead to applause. Sometimes it led to solitude, to sleepless nights, to the painful realization that doing the right thing could still hurt everyone involved. Keanu had built his life on integrity, on treating others with respect even when no one was watching. And now that very integrity demanded something difficult of him. One evening, after a long day that left him emotionally drained, he found himself at a small charity event meant to pass unnoticed. He preferred it that way. Children laughed nearby, their resilience shining brighter than any spotlight. As he listened to their stories of hardship faced with courage far beyond their years, something inside him shifted. A young boy, no older than 10, looked up at him with curious eyes and asked a question that felt heavier than it should have. "Is it hard to choose what's right when everything feels important?" Keanu smiled gently, but the question stayed with him long after the night ended. That was when he understood that his struggle was not unique. Everyone, in their own way, faced moments where kindness alone could not provide answers, where doing nothing was still a decision, and silence carried consequences. He realized that avoiding pain was no longer an option. The only question left was what kind of pain he was willing to carry, and whether he had the courage to face it with the same grace he had shown the world for so long. As the night faded into early morning, Keanu stood once more by the window, watching the city wake. He knew this was only the beginning. The choice ahead would test everything he believed about love, honesty, and selflessness, and for the first time he allowed himself to admit the truth he had been avoiding. The toughest role he would ever play was not on screen. It was in his own life, where there were no scripts, no rehearsals, only the quiet demand to be brave. When silence starts to speak. The days that followed did not slow down for Keanu Reeves, even though something inside him felt as if it had come to a standstill. Work continued, obligations stacked neatly on his calendar, and the world moved with the same relentless rhythm it always had, yet his inner life grew heavier with each passing hour. Silence had once been his refuge, a place where he could think, feel, and heal without interference. Now that same silence began to change its shape, turning from comfort into pressure, from peace into a quiet demand for truth. He noticed it most in the smallest moments, the pauses between conversations, the empty spaces after laughter faded, the way his thoughts lingered long after a room had emptied. Sandra Bullock remained a steady presence, not by force but by familiarity. When they spoke, their conversations flowed effortlessly, rich with shared memory and gentle humor, touching on life, work, and the strange journey that had shaped them both. There was a depth to their connection that did not require explanation, a history built on trust rather than expectation. With Sandra, Keanu felt understood in a way that came only from years of mutual respect and emotional honesty. Yet beneath that comfort, a question hovered unspoken, growing heavier because neither of them named it. He sensed that she, too, felt the shift, that subtle change in the air when what is left unsaid begins to matter more than what is spoken. At the same time, Ana de Armas entered his days with a different kind of presence, one that felt like possibility rather than memory. Their time together was quieter, marked by shared silences that never felt awkward, by thoughtful conversations that unfolded slowly, without urgency. Ana did not ask him to be anything other than what he was in that moment. She accepted the pauses, the introspection, the careful way he navigated emotions he had learned to protect. With her, Keanu felt the unfamiliar sensation of looking forward rather than backward, of imagining a future that was not defined by loss or regret. And that, too, frightened him, because hope had a way of making one vulnerable. What troubled him most was not the presence of two meaningful connections, but the growing realization that avoiding a decision was itself becoming a decision. He began to see how his silence affected those around him, even when no one openly complained. A hesitation before Sandra spoke, a lingering look from Ana that carried more question than expectation. These moments began to accumulate, forming a quiet weight that pressed against his conscience. Keanu had built his life on kindness and respect, on the belief that treating others with dignity was the truest measure of character. Now he faced the unsettling truth that kindness without clarity could unintentionally cause harm. The world outside his private struggle continued to speculate, weaving narratives from fragments and assumptions, but Keanu paid little attention. He had never lived for headlines, and he was not about to start now. Still, the noise seeped in not through screens or articles, but through the subtle tension that followed him into public spaces. People watched more closely, listened more carefully, as if expecting him to reveal something simply by standing still. He responded with the same calm he always had, yet inside, the question echoed louder each day. How long could he remain silent without betraying the very values he held dear? One evening, after a long day that left him emotionally exhausted, Keanu took a walk through a quiet neighborhood, letting the rhythm of his steps guide his thoughts. He remembered moments from his past, times when loss had taught him the importance of honesty, when avoiding pain had only delayed healing. He thought of conversations where truth, spoken gently, had brought relief rather than destruction. And he wondered why now he struggled to offer that same honesty to the people he cared for most. The answer, he realized, was fear, not of rejection, but of hurting those who had shown him nothing but patience and grace. In the midst of this reflection, a chance encounter shifted something inside him. While visiting a small community center for a charity initiative, Keanu met an older man who spoke openly about a difficult choice he had once avoided for too long. The man described how silence, meant to protect, had instead deepened wounds that honesty might have healed sooner. Listening quietly, Keanu felt as though the story was being told directly to him. It was a reminder that good intentions did not absolve one from responsibility, and that courage was often required not to act, but to speak. That night, alone in his home, Keanu sat with his thoughts longer than usual. He replayed conversations, remembered shared smiles, and acknowledged the unspoken bonds that connected him to both Sandra and Anna. For the first time, he allowed himself to admit that his hesitation was no longer neutral. It was shaping outcomes, influencing emotions, and quietly defining relationships without consent. The realization unsettled him, but it also clarified something essential. He could not continue to stand in the middle, hoping time would choose for him. Time, he understood, was indifferent to kindness. As the hours passed, Keanu felt the weight of his gentle heart more acutely than ever before. He recognized that love, in its truest form, demanded honesty even when honesty was uncomfortable. The path ahead was still uncertain, but one thing became clear. Silence was no longer an option he could justify. Whatever came next would require him to face the truth directly, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the quiet integrity that had defined his life. And as dawn approached, he sensed that the calm before him was not an end, but the beginning of a deeper reckoning, one that would test his courage in ways no role ever had. The cost of waiting. By the time Keanu Reeves fully understood that waiting had a cost, the realization arrived not as a sudden shock, but as a slow ache that settled deep in his chest and refused to leave. Waiting had always felt safe to him, a neutral space where no one was hurt and nothing was decided. But now, as days slipped into weeks, he began to see that hesitation was shaping reality in ways he could no longer control. Every unanswered question, every gentle deflection, every thoughtful pause that once seemed harmless was quietly carving distance where closeness had once lived. With Sandra, the shift was subtle but undeniable. Their conversations were still warm, still intelligent, still filled with the ease that only comes from shared history, yet something fragile had entered the space between them. There were moments when she would smile and then fall silent, as if weighing whether to say something she had already decided to hold back. Keanu noticed how she listened a little longer than before, how her eyes searched his face not for reassurance, but for truth. He sensed that she was no longer simply enjoying the present, but trying to understand where she stood within it. The unspoken question lingered like a quiet shadow, never addressed, never dismissed. With Anna, the atmosphere carried a different tension, softer yet just as heavy. Their time together remained calm, thoughtful, and sincere, but Keanu felt the growing awareness beneath her gentleness. Anna was perceptive in a way that did not accuse or demand, but observed. She noticed his silences, the careful way he chose his words, the moments when he seemed present but distant all at once. Her patience was not weakness, it was intention. And that made his hesitation feel even more difficult to justify. He knew she was giving him space not because she lacked courage, but because she respected the complexity of his inner world. The more Keanu reflected, the clearer it became that both women were responding to the same absence, the absence of certainty. And that absence, though unspoken, carried emotional weight. He had always believed that kindness meant protecting others from pain, but now he began to understand that protection without transparency could become its own form of harm. He was not shielding them from discomfort. He was leaving them to navigate uncertainty alone. That realization unsettled him more deeply than any fear of confrontation ever had. One afternoon, after leaving a quiet meeting, Keanu found himself sitting alone in a park watching people pass by, each moving with purpose, direction, or at least the illusion of it. Couples walked hand in hand, friends laughed openly, strangers crossed paths without hesitation. Life, he observed, moved forward regardless of doubt, and he wondered when he had allowed himself to become someone who paused instead of lived. He remembered times in his past when clarity, even painful clarity, had ultimately led to healing. Why, then, was he resisting it now? The answer revealed itself slowly. It was not fear of rejection that held him back, nor fear of being alone. It was fear of being the source of someone else's pain. Having known loss so intimately, he carried a deep aversion to causing emotional harm. Yet life was teaching him a difficult truth. Avoiding pain was not the same as preventing it. Sometimes, delaying truth only prolonged suffering. And sometimes, courage was not loud or decisive, but quiet and deliberate, requiring one to face discomfort head-on. As the internal struggle intensified, small moments began to weigh more heavily. A delayed response to a message, A conversation that ended sooner than it once would have. A look that lingered just a second too long. These details, insignificant on their own, formed a pattern that Keanu could no longer ignore. He felt as though he were standing on a bridge suspended between two shores, aware that remaining in the middle indefinitely was impossible. Eventually, the structure would demand movement. One evening, after returning home from a long day, Keanu sat in stillness, the kind that invites honesty whether one is ready or not. He asked himself questions he had avoided for too long, not about who he cared for more, but about what kind of man he wanted to be in this moment of choice. Did he want to be someone remembered for kindness that avoided conflict, or for integrity that faced it with respect? The answer did not come easily, but it came clearly enough to unsettle him. He knew that the version of himself he respected most was not one who waited for circumstances to decide, but one who acted with intention. The cost of waiting had become evident not just in his relationships, but within himself. He felt divided, fragmented between past and possibility, between familiarity and growth. And that division was beginning to erode the sense of peace he valued so deeply. Keanu understood then that whatever decision lay ahead, it would require him to accept responsibility for its consequences. Love, he realized, was not only about connection, but about accountability. And accountability demanded clarity. As night fell, Keanu looked out into the darkness with a renewed awareness. The path forward was still uncertain, still complex, but one truth had emerged unmistakably. Remaining silent was no longer an act of kindness. It was an act of avoidance, and as difficult as it might be, he knew that the next step would require him to speak, to choose honesty over comfort and courage over delay. The waiting had already cost him enough. What came next would define not only his relationships, but the integrity of his heart. When truth demands courage. The moment Keanu Reeves accepted that clarity could no longer be postponed, a strange calm settled over him. Not the kind that erased fear, but the kind that made fear bearable. It was the calm that comes when a person finally admits the truth to himself, even if the path forward remains uncertain. He realized that the hardest part of any difficult choice was not the outcome, but the willingness to stand still long enough to face it honestly. For years, he had lived by intuition and kindness, trusting that gentle intentions would naturally lead to gentle results. Now he understood that intention alone was not enough. Truth required courage, and courage demanded action. His days began to feel sharper, more defined, as if every interaction carried meaning that could no longer be ignored. When he spoke with Sandra, he felt the weight of everything they had built together, the shared history that lived not only in memory but in the ease of their connection. Their conversations still flowed, but Keanu noticed how each word now felt like it rested on the edge of something deeper, something waiting to be acknowledged. Sandra had always been emotionally intelligent, perceptive without being intrusive, and he sensed that she was preparing herself, not for a specific answer, but for honesty itself. That awareness both comforted and unsettled him, because it reminded him that she deserved more than silence. With Anna, the shift was quieter but equally profound. Their time together carried a stillness that felt intentional, as if both of them were aware that something important was approaching. Anna's calm presence never pressured him, yet it challenged him in its own way. Her patience was not passive, it was rooted in self-respect. Keanu began to see that patience, when paired with awareness, was not an invitation to delay forever, but a grace period offered in trust. And trust, once stretched too far, could quietly begin to fray. As these realizations settled in, Keanu found himself reflecting more deeply on the nature of courage. Courage, he understood, was not about making the right choice according to outside standards, nor was it about pleasing everyone involved. True courage was about alignment, about ensuring that one's actions reflected one's values, even when the consequences were uncomfortable. He asked himself whether he was living in alignment or merely drifting between moments, hoping clarity would arrive on its own. The answer, though difficult, was clear. He had been waiting for certainty when what he truly needed was integrity. One night, unable to sleep, Keanu revisited memories of past decisions, moments when he had chosen honesty despite fear. He remembered how painful truths once spoken had eventually led to peace, even if the immediate aftermath had been difficult. Those memories reminded him that avoiding pain did not prevent it, but meeting it directly often transformed it. He realized that the choice before him was not just about relationships, but about his own sense of self. Who would he become if he continued to avoid clarity? And who might he become if he embraced it? As dawn approached, Keanu felt a quiet resolve take shape. He did not yet know exactly what he would say or how the conversations ahead would unfold, but he knew that silence was no longer an option he could justify. He understood that speaking honestly did not guarantee a painless outcome, but it honored the dignity of everyone involved. And dignity, he believed, was the foundation of real love. Without it, even the strongest connection could slowly erode. The following days were marked by preparation rather than action. Keanu took time to reflect, to listen more closely, to ensure that when he spoke, his words would come from a place of respect rather than confusion. He resisted the urge to rush, understanding that courage was not impulsive but deliberate. Each step he took was guided by a desire to be fair, not just to others but to himself. He began to accept that whatever followed would reshape his relationships, and that change, though painful, was sometimes necessary for growth. By the end of the week, Keanu stood on the threshold of a conversation that would alter the course of his life. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility, but beneath it, there was something new, a sense of steadiness rooted in self-awareness. He knew that truth, once spoken, could not be taken back, but he also knew that withholding it any longer would compromise everything he stood for. The moment was approaching when words would replace silence, and courage would be measured not by what he chose, but by how honestly he chose it. As he prepared to face what lay ahead, Keanu understood one final truth with striking clarity. Love was not proven by avoidance or hesitation, but by the willingness to stand in uncertainty and still speak with honesty. Whatever happened next would not define him by loss or gain, but by the integrity with which he met the moment. And for the first time in weeks, that knowledge brought him a sense of peace strong enough to carry him forward. The weight of honest words. When the moment finally arrived for Keanu Reeves to move beyond preparation and into action, it did not announce itself with drama or urgency. Instead, it came quietly, like a door opening in a familiar room, revealing a space he had always known was there but had not yet entered. The days of reflection had sharpened his awareness, and with that awareness came a heavy understanding. Honesty, once chosen, must be carried fully without retreat or excuse. He felt the weight of that responsibility settle over him, as he realized that the conversations ahead would not simply reveal his feelings, but would redefine the emotional landscape he shared with the people he cared for most. The first change he noticed was within himself. His thoughts, once tangled in hesitation, now moved with a clearer rhythm. He was no longer asking whether he should speak, but how to do so with respect and care. He understood that truth did not require harshness, nor did it demand complete certainty about the future. What it required was presence, the willingness to stand openly in the moment without hiding behind ambiguity. That realization did not ease his nerves, but it grounded him, reminding him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. In his interactions with Sandra, Keanu felt the quiet anticipation beneath their familiar exchanges. Their shared history gave every moment a sense of significance, as though each word carried echoes of everything they had been through together. He noticed how attentively she listened, how her expressions reflected both strength and vulnerability. Sandra had always valued honesty, not as a test, but as a foundation. Keanu sensed that she was ready to hear the truth, whatever form it took, and that readiness made the responsibility feel even heavier. He knew that speaking honestly would not erase their past, but it would shape how that past would continue to exist in their lives. With Anna, the dynamic held a different kind of intensity, quieter but no less profound. Their connection had been built on patience and mutual respect, and Keanu felt a deep appreciation for the space she had given him to understand himself. Yet he also recognized that space was not infinite. Anna's calm presence, once a comfort, now served as a mirror, reflecting his own need to act with integrity. He saw in her eyes an understanding that went beyond words, an awareness that something important was approaching. That awareness did not come with pressure, but with expectation, the expectation that he would honor the trust she had placed in him. As Keanu moved through these days, he found himself reflecting on the nature of love in a way he never had before. Love, he realized, was not defined by ease or familiarity, nor by excitement or possibility alone. It was defined by responsibility, by the willingness to consider how one's choices affected another's inner world. He understood that no matter what path he chose, there would be pain, but there could also be dignity. The difference lay in whether that pain was faced openly or allowed to linger in uncertainty. For someone who valued kindness above all else, this distinction mattered deeply. One evening, as he sat alone in the quiet of his home, Keanu rehearsed nothing. He did not practice speeches or imagine outcomes. Instead, he allowed himself to feel the full gravity of the situation, accepting that he could not control how others would respond. That acceptance brought an unexpected sense of relief. He realized that his responsibility was not to manage emotions, but to communicate truthfully and compassionately. Everything beyond that was part of the natural unfolding of human connection, something no amount of planning could dictate. The realization marked a turning point. Keanu no longer felt trapped between two possibilities, but called to honor both through honesty. He understood that respect did not always mean preserving comfort, and that courage did not always lead to immediate resolution. Sometimes, courage simply meant stepping forward and trusting that truth, however difficult, would ultimately lead to clarity. The weight of honest words still pressed on him, but it was a weight he now accepted willingly, knowing that carrying it was essential to remaining true to himself. As the days drew closer to the conversations he knew must happen, Keanu felt a sense of inevitability mixed with resolve. The waiting had served its purpose, teaching him the cost of delay and the value of intention. Now, action awaited him, not as a dramatic climax, but as a necessary continuation of a journey shaped by empathy, reflection, and respect. He knew that whatever followed would change things permanently, but he also knew that change, when guided by integrity, could be a form of healing rather than loss. In that understanding, Keanu found a quiet strength. He was no longer standing still, nor was he rushing forward blindly. He was moving deliberately, guided by values that had defined him long before this moment of choice. The words he would soon speak carried weight, but they also carried truth, and he trusted that truth, spoken with care, would honor the connections he cherished, even as it reshaped them. Choosing with integrity. When Keanu Reeves finally stepped into the moment he had been preparing for, it did not feel like an ending, nor did it feel like a victory. It felt like standing at the center of his own values, exposed but grounded, aware that whatever followed would be shaped not by fear or hesitation, but by honesty. The days of reflection had stripped away illusions, leaving him face to face with a simple but demanding truth. Love, when real, must be guided by integrity, even when integrity requires letting go of certainty and comfort. The conversations he had long postponed unfolded not as confrontations, but as acts of respect. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, only carefully chosen words carried by sincerity. Keanu spoke not to justify himself, but to reveal himself, sharing his confusion, his gratitude, and his unwillingness to let silence continue shaping emotions without consent. He acknowledged the depth of connection he shared, the meaning each relationship held, and the responsibility that came with that meaning. In doing so, he allowed vulnerability to replace avoidance, trusting that truth, however painful, was kinder than ambiguity. What surprised him most was not the difficulty of speaking, but the relief that followed. Once the words were no longer trapped inside him, the weight he had carried for so long began to loosen its grip. He realized that fear had amplified the moment far beyond its reality. Honesty did not destroy respect, it reinforced it. It did not erase connection, it clarified it. Even in moments of quiet sadness, there was dignity, and within that dignity, a sense of mutual understanding that softened the edges of loss. As time passed, the world continued to speculate, but Keanu felt strangely detached from the noise. The opinions of strangers no longer held power over his inner peace. What mattered was that he had acted in alignment with his principles, choosing transparency over convenience, respect over avoidance. He understood now that the toughest choices were rarely about selecting one outcome over another, but about deciding how one wished to live with the consequences. He had chosen to live without the burden of unresolved truth. In the weeks that followed, Keanu noticed subtle changes within himself. His thoughts felt quieter, less burdened by internal conflict. He moved through his days with a renewed sense of presence, no longer divided between past and possibility. The relationships in his life, though altered, were marked by honesty rather than uncertainty. He accepted that not every story concluded with perfect symmetry, and that some resolutions were defined not by possession, but by respect. That acceptance brought him a form of peace he had not anticipated. Looking back, Keanu recognized that the journey had taught him something essential about the nature of love and resilience. Love was not proven by how tightly one held on, but by how carefully one treated the hearts entrusted to them. Resilience was not about enduring silence, but about facing discomfort with openness and humility. These lessons, hard-earned and deeply felt, reshaped his understanding of connection, reminding him that strength and gentleness were not opposites, but partners. As he stood once more by the window that had witnessed so many sleepless nights, Keanu watched the city move below, alive with countless stories unfolding at once. He felt no regret for the time spent waiting, only gratitude for the clarity it had ultimately brought. The path ahead remained uncertain, as all meaningful paths do, but he walked it now without division, guided by the same quiet principles that had always defined him. In choosing integrity, Keanu did not claim a simple answer, nor did he escape pain entirely. What he gained instead was something far more enduring, the knowledge that he had met a difficult moment with honesty, compassion, and courage. And in that knowledge, he found the strength to move forward, carrying with him not the weight of unresolved silence, but the calm assurance that comes from living in alignment with one's truest self.